In the winter of 1880, deep in the wild heart of Yellowstone, a lone man built a cabin beside Soda Butte Creek and prepared to face the season in silence. His name was Harry Yount, a former soldier turned frontiersman sent by the federal government to guard a park that barely existed on paper. For 14 months, he patrolled a wilderness larger than some states, fending off poachers, blizzards, and isolation. In the process, he became something entirely new, the first park ranger in American history. For Footprints of the Frontier, this is the epic true tale of Harry S. Yount, legend of the frontier, guardian of the Old West, and the godfather of the Yellowstone National Park. This is his story. Before he became a figure of Western legend, before he became a mountain man, a bullwhacker, a prospector, or the first to play keeper of the keys and grounds at Yellowstone National Park, Harry Yount came from humble beginnings. His early life was shaped by the quiet, enduring struggles of a frontier family. He was born on the edge of Missouri's wilderness, where the line between settled country and open frontier still shifted with every passing season. The Younts were self-reliant people, their story bound to the long arc of America's westward march. The records from Harry's youth are thin, more rumor than fact in some places. His full name, Henry S. Yount, was often written wrong in print, and even his birthplace and date were long debated. The best accounts come from a series of interviews he gave as an old man, sometime in the early 1920s. Family stories claimed the Younts had once been Yonkers, a name supposedly tied to the town of Yonkers, New York. Harry said 2 brothers had come to America long ago. One stayed in New York, the other pushed west to Pennsylvania, where the name shifted to Yount. But no record has ever proven that claim. What we do know is that the Yount line came from Alsace, a village on the Rhine and along the borderland caught between France and Germany. Hans George and Anna Maria Yount, Harry's distant ancestors, landed in Philadelphia in 1731 with their children. Their descendants moved south into North Carolina, and from there, west into Missouri after the Louisiana Purchase opened new ground for settlers. By the time Harry was born, March 18, 1839, his grandfather Jacob Yount had already settled in Washington County, a patch of hilly Missouri farmland southwest of St. Louis. His father, David Yount, was nearing middle age, and Harry was the 10th of 11 children. The 1850 census lists Henry Yount, age 11, living with his parents and brothers. Life there was quiet but demanding. Schooling was sparse, though Harry learned enough to read and write clear, plain letters in adulthood. He was of a childhood of chores, of hunting, farm work, and long days in the company of family and animals, rather than society or schooling. The Yount's lineage also originates from land once crossed by Joseph Smith and his followers, but there's no sign the family ever took part in the early Mormon movement that swept through the region. The Younts' own roots were Quaker, tracing back to their Pennsylvania ancestors. If Harry had carried any religion west with him, it was likely quiet and practical, more moral compass than creed. Confusion about his origins lingered for decades. Some writers placed his birth in Harmony Township, Pennsylvania. Others claimed that the year landed in the 1840s. It took combing through enlistment papers and pension records by later historians that set the matter straight. The evidence confirmed what Harry himself wrote in a 1915 affidavit. He was born in Missouri in March 1839. However, his middle initial, S, remains a mystery. Like many frontier families, the Younts eventually scattered. Two of Harry's older brothers, Caleb and John, followed their uncle, George, to California, where George C. Yount became one of the first American settlers in Napa Valley. He was granted land by the Mexican government and lent his name to the town of Yountville. Another brother moved to Illinois, while Harry stayed in Missouri for a time. The pattern was typical for the era. Each generation moved farther west in search of opportunity, leaving behind roots that grew shallower with every mile. Washington County itself was a crossroads of sorts. Rough farmland, thick timber, and the restless edge of American settlement. It was a place where a boy could learn to ride, shoot, forage, and above all, live on his own. That environment shaped the man Harry became. Before Yellowstone, before the scout work and the soldiering, he was simply a Missouri boy raised on the hard lessons of the frontier. Whatever filled Harry Yount's years before the war remains unanswered. He never wrote about that time, and no record survives to tell us where he went or what he did. When the war finally came to Missouri, he was already a grown man, and like many frontiersmen, he joined the Union ranks without hesitation. On November 9, 1861, he enlisted in Company F of Phelps Regiment, Missouri Infantry, a short-term volunteer unit raised to secure the state's loyalty. His commanding officer, John S. Phelps, was a Missouri politician turned Union colonel, and his men were drawn from the farms, the mines, and the border towns of a state divided against itself. Phelps' regiment was a temporary force, 6 months of service during the bitter early fighting for Missouri. The unit fell under Brigadier General Samuel R. Curtis in the Army of the Southwest, a force charged with driving Confederate troops out of the border country. Through the winter of 1861 and into 1862, Yount's company marched across southern Missouri and into the Ozark Highlands of Arkansas, following Curtis toward one of the largest engagements west of the Mississippi, the Battle of Pea Ridge. That battle, fought in early March 1862, decided the fate of Missouri. Confederate General Earl Van Dorn led 16,000 men north across frozen hills to crush Curtis's smaller army and reclaim the state for the South. The march was brutal. Hungry, cold soldiers forced their way through sleet and mud, many of them without tents or wagons, after Van Dorn's reckless order to travel light. Curtis, alerted by his scouts, dug in along Little Sugar Creek, blocking the roads with felled timber and placing artillery high on the bluffs overlooking the Wire Road. The fighting began with scattered skirmishes near Bentonville. Union detachments, including Yount's regiment, clashed with Confederate cavalry sweeping through the back roads. The next day brought a full battle. Van Dorn tried to encircle Curtis, striking both flanks at once. Price's Missourians attacked from the northeast near Elkhorn Tavern, with McCulloch's Texans advancing from the west toward Leetown. The fighting at Leetown was savage. McCulloch was shot dead leading a charge, his second in command soon after him. Command broke apart, and confusion spread through the Confederate ranks. East of there, at Elkhorn Tavern, Union Colonel Eugene Carr's men held the high ground through sheer stubbornness, repelling charge after charge, even after Carr himself was shot 3 times. When morning came, the tide had turned. Curtis regrouped his men and unleashed a massive artillery barrage that shattered the Confederate lines. Van Dorn's army broke and fled. The Battle of Pea Ridge clinched the North a substantial victory, holding ground in Missouri and opening up northern Arkansas to the Bluebellies. But Yount wouldn't even make it to the first full day of fighting. thanks to a small skirmish occurring the day before the battle actually began. The story goes that on the eve of Pea Ridge, while serving on the forward line, Harry Yount was wounded in the leg and captured by Confederate scouts. He was forced to march 90 miles, barefoot, across the wet, stony Ozark terrain to Fort Smith, Arkansas. The journey took days. His feet were torn and bloodied, his wounds untreated, his captors driving him onward through freezing rain. He was held prisoner for nearly a month at Fort Smith, where food was scarce and medical care non-existent. The exposure left him with a lifelong battle with rheumatism that would trouble him for decades. Yount was released in a prisoner exchange and returned to Union lines. The damage was done. His term ended soon after, and he was discharged in May 1862. Just 6 months later, though, he had re-enlisted, this time with the 8th Missouri Volunteer Cavalry. He signed up on August 9, 1862, for a 3-year term that would take him deep into the border wars in Missouri and Arkansas. With the cavalry, Yount found his calling. He rose steadily through the ranks, private, corporal, sergeant, and finally, company quartermaster sergeant. By all intents and purposes, it was not a glamorous post, but it was one of critical responsibility. He managed the company's supplies, building an inventory of feed for the horses, rations for the men, tents, ammunition, tools, and uniforms. He oversaw the wagons, inspected mounts, and kept the paperwork that held the army together. In the field, he organized forage patrols and kept men fed when official supply lines broke down. His work required as much grit as any soldier on the battlefield. The 8th Missouri Cavalry operated in the rough, lawless country along the Arkansas-Missouri line, battling Confederate raiders and guerrilla bands who struck from the woods and vanished into the hills. It was a war of attrition, fought across ridges and river crossings, where cold camps and empty bellies were as dangerous as any rifle. Yount's years in that service hardened him. He had known captivity, exposure, and the slow grind of army life. When peace finally came in 1865, he was a seasoned survivor of the Western Front and a man who understood the cost of endurance. That understanding would follow him into his next chapter. The discipline and toughness he carried out of the Ozarks became the foundation for his later life as a scout, a hunter, and eventually, the man many would one day call Rocky Mountain Harry Yount. When Harry Yount came home from war in the summer of 1865, the country he returned to was already moving again. The railroads were spreading west, and soldiers who had fought through the border states now looked toward the frontier for work. Discharged from the Union Army at Little Rock, Yount headed north to Missouri and then west toward Nebraska. By 1866, he had reached Fort Kearny, a way station on the Oregon Trail where the steady line of ox-drawn freight wagons stretched endlessly toward the mountains. It was here that he made a clean break from his soldier's life and stepped into the uncertain world of the post-war frontier. Yount took work as a bullwhacker. Bullwhackers were drivers of oxen teams hauling freight for the U.S. Army. The job was grueling and dangerous, the pay meager, but it offered steady work and freedom. His route followed the Bozeman Trail, a narrow corridor running from Fort Laramie in Wyoming to Fort C.F. Smith in Montana. The trail cut straight through the heart of the Powder River country. That land belonged to the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, who fought fiercely to defend it. Every trip meant long weeks exposed to the elements, guiding lumbering oxen over muddy roads and rocky fords, while always watching the horizon for movement that might mean an ambush. In one of his many encounters, Yount's wagon train came under an attack from a Sioux party that shadowed them for 4 full days. Ammunition was running low, and the men were exhausted. When the warriors finally closed in, Yount leveled his carbine and brought down one of their horses, ending the pursuit. Years later, Yount spoke of that fight with a kind of weary understanding. He said he didn't blame the tribes for protecting what was rightfully theirs. In his words, they were only defending their country. He also accepted the grim logic of what followed, saying that the government would keep pushing west until the buffalo were gone, because once the herds were destroyed, the tribes would have nothing left to live on. After his years on the Bozeman Trail, Yount drifted deeper into the frontier economy, trading his whip for a rifle. The plains were thick with buffalo then, and the new rail towns like Cheyenne became gathering points for hunters selling meat, hides, and tongues. Yount joined that trade, though not without a sense of guilt. He called it, quote, a pity to kill off the buffaloes, end quote. But he did it anyway, knowing the market demanded it. Each tongue fetched $1, and the rail agents paid cash. By the early 1870s, Yount had built a life as a hunter and trapper across the high country of southern Wyoming and northern Colorado. He roamed the Medicine Bow Range, the Wind River Country, and the Snowy Range, spending months alone in the wilderness. In that era, the mountains were alive with game, elk, deer, pronghorns, and the last wandering herds of mountain buffalo. He hunted bighorns in the cliffs and once stumbled into a clearing surrounded by 7 grizzly bears. His hunts were not for sport though. Every cartridge counted, and every animal served a purpose: food, fur, trade. He sometimes hunted antelope from a wagon, circling outward across the plains until he had filled it. Once, in a contest with an eastern marksman, he killed 70 antelope in a single day, a feat he later regretted. In the quiet years that followed, he always spoke of those early hunts with humility, admitting that the wastefulness of those times had left a bitter taste in his mouth. Each winter, he withdrew to the foothills to trap and live off the land. His camps were simple. He built tents from canvas, robes from buffalo hides, and tinkered with simple tools like a small bake oven, traps, and rifles. He carried flour, bacon, beans, coffee, and tobacco. Nothing more than he needed. During his hardest winters, he survived on meat, dried berries, and boiled roots, brewing sage tea for warmth. Over time, his life grew more comfortable as his experience deepened. He became a master woodsman, reading the landscape like a book. He followed tracks, studied droppings, detected dens, and noted where a plant had been nibbled or a branch bent. In the early 1870s, the Smithsonian Institution hired him to collect animal specimens from the West. Working under Spencer Baird, Yount sent back mounted elk, bears, wolves, and smaller mammals from the Rockies. His work was meticulous, his specimens well preserved, and the Smithsonian brought him on again in 1875 for a second expedition. Many of his collections were later shown where city dwellers could see, for the first time, the wildlife of the American frontier. Harry Yount undoubtedly inspired countless young minds, educated the masses. Yount called his way of working the, quote, science of hunting. He learned to tell the difference between the calls of pronghorns and deer, to decipher a grouse's trail from half-eaten pine cones, and to know the habits of elk simply by the leaves they chewed. In time, his skills bridged the gap between the old life of the hunter and the new world of natural science. By the early 1870s, Harry Yount had moved beyond the solitary life of a trapper and hunter. Years of roaming the mountains alone had hardened him, but they had also taught him discipline and patience. It would be these qualities that eventually drew the attention of men like Ferdinand van de Veer Hayden. Around 1872, Yount joined Hayden's Geological Survey, a federal expedition charged with charting the uncharted and cataloging the natural wealth of the Western Territories. His work as a packer and a guide marked a turning point. The free-ranging mountain man was now part of something larger, a government effort to understand the land that had once belonged to the wilderness alone. Hayden's survey operated under the Department of the Interior and laid the groundwork for what would later become the U.S. Geological Survey. These teams of scientists and scouts worked through the high country of the Rockies at a time when much of the region remained unmarked on any reliable map. They endured hard travel, thin air, and unpredictable weather, often setting up camp in terrain where the next human settlement might lie hundreds of miles away. For Harry Yount, it was familiar work, dressed for official purposes. He handled the mules, guided the surveyors through canyons and overpasses, and saw to it that every man and every instrument reached camp in one piece. The timing of this new role was significant. Only months earlier, President Ulysses S. Grant had signed the act establishing Yellowstone National Park, the first of its kind anywhere in the world. Hayden's earlier surveys of that same region had helped convince Congress of its importance. So when Harry Yount entered the employ of the Hayden Survey, he was stepping directly into the era when America first began to think of its wilderness as a landscape worth preserving. For 7 summers, from 1872 through 1879, Yount worked with Hayden's expeditions across the West. He moved through the Badlands of New Mexico, the mesas of Arizona, the mountains of Wyoming and Colorado. In each new season, he guided the mule trains loaded with tents, cooking gear, and fragile instruments. When the survey ended each fall, he returned to Wyoming's Laramie Range to hunt and trap through the winter. These cycles of fieldwork and isolation defined his life through the 1870s. It's important to note, survival in those years was never guaranteed. The men who worked the frontier faced dangers beyond gunfire or disease. A single storm could kill an entire company of freighters, their wagons burned out, and horses frozen in their traces. Yount often wintered alone, and he knew that a moment's carelessness could mean death. Prospectors vanished into the mountains chasing gold veins that were never found, their bones discovered years later beside rusted pans and broken picks. One of Yount's worst ordeals came during a spring snowstorm in the mid-1870s while he was trapping along the tributary of the Platte River. The storm buried his tent under several feet of snow and raged for nearly 2 days. Trapped inside with his trusty dog, he weighed whether to dig it out or wait. When the storm finally broke, he cut through the tent roof and clawed his way to daylight, nearly suffocating in the drift. The experience taught him to favor exposure over shelter. After that, he would rather face a blizzard than risk being buried again. That same year brought another bitter winter. While camped near Fort Laramie, Yount endured 45 straight days of snow and bitter cold so severe that even the wildlife seemed on the verge of extinction. He found refuge in a small stand of trees and survived on old venison, though wolves raided his stored meat, forcing him to hunt smaller game. He watched deer gather on the wind-blown buttes where the snow had scoured away the grass, and he saw wolves starve beside their kills. Not long after that, while serving as hunter for a different geologist expedition, Yount faced down another grizzly that charged him from a thicket. He emptied his rifle into the beast, each shot placed with unflinching precision, until the animal collapsed within reach. All in all, it was a season that would have broken many men, but not Harry Yount. The scientists who worked with Yount came to depend on him. He was methodical and quietly competent, the sort of man who did not waste words or bullets. He had none of the recklessness common to frontier adventurers. When storms tore through camp or horses bolted on narrow trails, he was the one who stayed calm and worked the problem. His survival stories always carried the same matter-of-fact tone, free of boasting and shaped by a deep respect for the land's power to humble any man. Though he lacked formal schooling, Yount had the observational sense of a proven naturalist. He understood that the wilderness was neither enemy nor ally, but a living thing, governed by its own order. Those who knew him during the Hayden expedition years often remarked on his modesty, his careful work, and his quiet moral code. In a time when many men sought fortune and destruction, Yount had learned the value of endurance and restraint. These traits would later make him the ideal guardian of the United States' first national park. Harry Yount was a man uniquely suited to protect the very wild country he had once made his living from. Enter the Godfather of Yellowstone. When Yellowstone was declared a national park in 1872, the idea was groundbreaking, but the execution was almost non-existent. Congress had set aside over 2 million acres of land, but provided no money and no real plan to protect it. The park's first superintendent, Nathaniel Langford, was handed a title, but not a paycheck. For 5 years, he served without a staff or supplies, relying only on personal conviction to hold together an impossible task. Visitors came and went freely. Hunters slaughtered animals for sport. Vandals broke off geyser formations as souvenirs, and there was no one there to stop them. By 1877, Langford had had enough. Disillusioned, he stepped down, leaving Yellowstone as vulnerable as the day it was created. That same year, Philetus Walter Norris took charge. A former soldier and frontiersman, Norris brought both energy and administrative skill to a park still struggling to exist on paper. He convinced Congress to release the first real budget, $10,000 in 1878, followed by $15,000 in 1880, and began turning Yellowstone from an idea into action. Roads were cut through the wilderness, bridges built over its rivers, guideposts raised to help visitors find their way. Norris knew the park's greatest challenge was protection. Illegal hunting was rampant, and the wildlife that made Yellowstone unique was rapidly disappearing. To counter that, he created a new position in 1880, the gamekeeper. It was a modest role, paid $1,000 a year, or nearly 7% of the entire budget. It marked the first official effort by the US government to guard wildlife on public land. The concept behind the gamekeeper was simple but revolutionary. The park needed someone who could both live in and observe the wilderness, standing in as a physical deterrent to poachers and vandals. Norris's 1877 superintendent report had already floated the idea of turning Yellowstone's northeast corner, particularly the Lamar Valley, into a refuge for animals during the harsh winters. Under the Department of the Interior and Secretary Carl Schurz, the refuge came alive. The only problem, they needed the perfect man to fit the bill. For that job, Norris chose a man who already knew the land better than anyone, Harry Yount. His appointment likely came through both familiarity and reputation. Yount had worked for years on the aforementioned Hayden geological surveys, including the 1878 expedition through Yellowstone itself. His discipline had already proven steady and unshakably self-reliant. In the summer of 1880, Secretary Schurz delivered Yount's commission while he was in Cheyenne, Wyoming. From there, Yount took a long route by rail and stage to reach Yellowstone, arriving at headquarters in early July. He began work immediately, accompanying the secretary himself on a tour through the park's rivers, geysers, and canyons. Over that first season, Yount traversed nearly every major region: Madison Junction, the Yellowstone Canyon, Clark's Fork, and on through the southern lakes and mountain passes. He studied the lay of the land and took careful note of the wildlife, from elk and moose in the valleys to antelope grazing along open ridges. His observations were practical and precise, distinguishing the character of each stream and the abundance of fish in its waters. When the season turned, Yount chose to remain through the winter. He built a small log cabin beside Soda Butte Creek, near the confluence of the East Fork and Soda Butte valleys. The spot gave him access to water, timber, and open sightlines across prime wintering ground for both elk and bison. It also put him near the border, where miners and trappers slipped into the park to hunt illegally. Through months of isolation, Yount lived as the first year-round resident of Yellowstone, tending fires through snowbound nights and keeping watch for poachers. His written report from that winter reads like a field journal of both the land and its animals. He recorded where each species gathered, how they moved through the seasons, and what threatened their survival. He also recognized a central problem. The animals did not recognize park boundaries, and once they crossed into settled territory, they were quickly killed. Yount also understood the futility of his situation. No single man, he wrote, could patrol over 3,000 square miles of wilderness. His solution was blunt but visionary. He proposed a small, well-trained police force to enforce park laws, protect wildlife, and preserve the landscape's natural wonders. That proposal would become the seed of a much larger idea in just a matter of months. When the snows came in late 1880, Harry Yount settled into that small cabin he had built, tucked into the northeast corner of Yellowstone National Park. That winter tested every ounce of endurance he had. For months at a time, he saw no one. Occasionally, a messenger or fellow worker rode in from Mammoth Hot Springs, but most of the season passed in silence. The land was beautiful, but the work was lonely. It was the kind of solitude that few men could stand for long. The Clark's Fork settlements lay 20 miles northwest, Mammoth 40 miles farther west, and between them stretched mountains buried under deep snow. Harry Yount was cut off from the world, surrounded by cold wind, empty sky, and the distant cries of wolves. When Yount later wrote that he was likely the only man within dozens of miles, he wasn't exaggerating. The snow that winter was relentless, piling high even in the valleys. Yount recorded that the drifts around his cabins reached several feet deep and stayed that way for months. Only a few slopes near Mount Norris remained open, where the warmth of underground heat and steady winds cleared patches of ground. It was there when Yount's thermometer broke early in the winter, leaving him to estimate the temperatures as best he could. But his daily notes, fair, snowy, stormy, windy, formed one of the first written records of Yellowstone's winter weather. His observations from that time remain among the earliest wildlife accounts ever made in the park. He tracked where animals wintered, how large the herds were, and when they began to move with the changing conditions. He counted hundreds of elk across the East Fork and Soda Butte valleys, watched bighorn sheep cling to the exposed slopes of Firehorn Basin, and noted that bison herds split between the Slow Creek and Hell-Roaring regions. He saw deer and antelope move down the Yellowstone Valley once the snows deepened, while moose stayed near the willow swamps around the southern lakes. Even small predators, foxes and wolverines, appeared in his notes, their tracks etched across the snow. Through that first winter, Yount began to understand how deeply everything in the park was connected. The animals, the snow, the warmth of the ground, and even the human intrusions at its edges formed a single delicate system. And while he did what he could to deter poachers, the harsh winter confirmed the truth. One man could not protect all of Yellowstone. Still, Yount kept to his duties. He spoke respectfully of the miners near Clark's Fork, noting that most hunted only to feed themselves and not for profit. He seemed to rely more on understanding and conversation than his own authority. This quiet diplomacy helped him maintain peace on the park's edges. His isolation might have suited him, but he worked well with others when needed, maintaining friendly ties with the small staff at Mammoth Hot Springs. When the spring thaw arrived in 1881, the mountains softened and the rivers broke free. The weather turned pleasant, and Yount was able to move again, using snowshoes and pack animals to patrol new ground. The return of travelers brought trouble too. Some tourists, not the hunters, shot wildlife for sport, while a small group of Bannock hunters entered the park to chase game near North Madison. Yount's responsibilities grew that summer. He was called on to guide officials and dignitaries through the backcountry, including Wyoming's Governor John Hoyt and Colonel Mason. Together, they crossed the rugged high country between Two Ocean Pass and Firehole Basin. Later, he assisted Superintendent Norris on a long inspection through the park's mountain ranges, scouting trails and studying routes that might one day be used for roads. Along the way, he hunted game to supply meat for the workers. When Norris returned later that year, he was less than pleased. To his mind, Yount had spent too much time focused on animals and not enough on road construction, which Norris saw as the park's true priority. He described Yount as a good hunter, but no game preserver, a man who belonged in the wilderness, but not necessarily in administration. Behind that criticism was a fundamental difference in vision. Norris was a builder and promoter, while Harry Yount believed Yellowstone's purpose was to remain untouched and alive. The conflict ended quietly. Yount had already planned to resign by season's end, weary of the isolation and aware that the role was unsustainable. His final report, filed in September 1881, thanked his superiors for their courtesy, summarized his observations, and repeated his call for a small trained police force to safeguard the park. With that, the first gamekeeper in U.S. history laid down his post and rode out of Yellowstone for a final time. Even after resigning, his influence was only getting started. The system he proposed, a corps of field officers tasked with protecting wildlife, guiding visitors, maintaining trails, eventually took root decades later as the National Park Ranger Service. Yount's single winter of solitude became a symbol of dedication, and his simple insight that one man could not guard a wilderness alone became the guiding principle of a nationwide institution. In time, the word ranger came to define that role, borrowed from the old frontier term for mounted lawmen who patrolled the wilds of Texas and the southern plains. The title carried with it an image of vigilance and frontier justice. Forest rangers and park rangers would later diverge in purpose, one managing resources, the other preserving them, but their roots shared a common spirit. Modern park rangers stand as guardians of the same ideals Yount embodied. They protect the land and its wildlife, guide the public through its wonders, and carry on a duty that is both practical and deeply symbolic. In their uniforms and quiet watchfulness, they represent the balance between humanity and wilderness. When Harry Yount left Yellowstone in the fall of 1881, he stepped quietly out of the pages of history. His time as the park's first gamekeeper had barely lasted over a year, yet the mark he left on the idea of public land protection would endure far longer than his brief tenure. Once he resigned, the paper trail of his life all but vanished, and for the next 30 years, his name surfaced only occasionally, in sparse documents and in scattered recollections from the few who knew him personally. By the early 1890s, Yount was living in Laramie County, Wyoming, somewhere in the Uva district. Government pension documents from that period confirmed his residence, offering one of the few verifiable details from this quieter stretch of life. Before long, he moved further north to Platte County, settling near the foot of Sugarloaf Mountain. It was there, on a small homestead he later sold to another frontiersman, that Yount returned to the rhythms of a solitary existence. He was prospecting. He was exploring. He was working the land as he always had. The last decades of his life were spent in the same Rocky Mountains he had once crossed as a hunter and survey guide. He devoted himself to mining, chasing veins of copper and graphite across the Laramie Mountains, and developing claims in the Bluegrass District. Though most of these ventures yielded modest results, one successful sale reportedly provided him a degree of financial security that lasted into later years. During the 1890s, he also discovered a marble deposit west of Wheatland, which became another small but notable enterprise. Remarkably, he continued to explore well into his 80s, still hiking into the canyons and high ridges of southern Wyoming, with the same steady patience that had carried him through the wilderness decades earlier. Those who knew Yount in his later years described a man both rugged and dignified, whose frontier manner never slipped into carelessness. His clothes reflected that same pride. His holster, belt, and saddle were fitted with polished metal pieces, and he often wore a fringed buckskin jacket made for him by a Shoshone woman, decorated with fur and intricate beadwork. The jacket was a symbol of the life he had lived between two worlds, the disciplined soldier and the free-ranging mountaineer. Writers, who met him near the end of his life, portrayed him as thoughtful and reserved, a man of firm moral grounding who carried an old-fashioned gentleness beneath his rough exterior. One observer wrote that his heart was, quote, as tender as a girl's, and that he loved the beauty of the wilderness even while surviving off its hardships. Yount was proof that a man could live a frontier life without losing his sense of decency or compassion. His respect for nature was not romanticized nor theoretical. Around 1812, Harry Yount finally settled in Wheatland, Wyoming, the quiet railroad town north of Cheyenne. He bought a small brick home with a wooden addition on its west side and lived alone but content. Yount remained single his whole life. At one point, he had been engaged to a Western Union employee named Estella Braun in the 1860s, but her tragic death in a train collision outside of Detroit ended any chance of marriage. Even in old age, he kept to a routine of long morning walks into town, visiting the post office or greeting neighbors before returning home. Residents described him as polite, soft-spoken, and always neatly dressed. On the morning of May 16, 1924, Yount set out on one of those daily walks. He made it only a few blocks before collapsing near the Lutheran church. Witnesses said he fell without a sound. The death certificate listed his cause of death as, quote, suspended heart action. Official records marked him as 88 years old, though later research suggests he was closer to 85. Per his own request, Yount was buried in Lakeview Cemetery in Cheyenne, among the graves of soldiers and early settlers he had once known. Today, Harry Yount's name is etched into the geography he once roamed. Yount Peak, in the Absaroka Range east of the Continental Divide, rises over the headwaters of the Yellowstone River. From those slopes, the river flows north through the park he once guarded, a fitting tribute to the man who first tried to protect it. Though Yount's time as a park employee was brief, his vision outlasted him. His reports from 1880 and 1881 laid the groundwork for what would become the ranger profession. Decades later, the National Park Service would embody that exact vision when it was founded in 1916. Today, Harry Rocky Mountain Yount is remembered as the first true ranger in American history, a man who bridged the age of untamed wilderness and the era of national preservation. His 14 months alone in Yellowstone painted the picture that protecting wild places demanded structure, discipline, and an enduring sense of duty. And every ranger who walks a park boundary, patrols a backcountry trail, or guards a herd of elk in winter, a small part of Harry Yount's spirit still lingers, forever watching over the land he loved. He was a prisoner of war, a man of mountains, the Godfather of Yellowstone, and the first park ranger. But he was also just Harry S. Yount, a pure human spirit of the Old West.